They sold the virgin bride for $3 in the street until the Lakota chief said, "Not for silver." The sun stood high and merciless over the dusty main street of Dry Creek when they brought the girl out, wrists bound with rope and a price already decided, a bride for $3, sold at noon because that was when shame burned hottest. The crowd pressed close, hats shading eyes, boots shifting in the dirt as the auctioneer's voice cracked through the heat like a whip. $3 for a wife, gentlemen, $3 for obedience and supper, he barked, and laughter rose loud and mean, filling the space where decency ought to live. She stood small and still on the wagon bed, hair loose, dress torn at the hem, the faint trace of road dust on her cheeks where tears had dried. No one asked her name. A silver coin clinked against the trough, rolling to rest near her bare feet, and she didn't move, just stared past the crowd like she was already gone. The sheriff leaned on a post pretending he didn't see. The preacher looked away, pretending he couldn't, and the men watching pretended this was the West's idea of order. Then came the sound, slow, deep, cutting through laughter like thunder over glass, the hoofbeats of a horse that didn't hurry for anyone. The crowd parted without knowing why. A Lakota man rode in from the far end of the street, tall in the saddle, braids dark as night water, face carved in quiet stone. He dismounted without a word, boots whispering against the boards, and walked to the wagon. $3, the auctioneer said, holding out his hand, grinning as if mercy were a joke. The chief looked down at the coins, then at the girl, then back at the man, and shook his head once. "Not for silver," he said. The words landed like a prayer dropped into fire, soft, absolute, final. The laughter died. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. He reached into the small leather pouch at his belt and drew out nothing but dust, scattering it into the light. "For her soul," he said quietly. "The sky pays." And before anyone could answer, he took off his blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, lifting her down from the wagon with hands that had buried friends and blessed enemies. No one stopped him. The sheriff found something to study in his boots. The preacher crossed himself without meaning to. The chief led her through the silence, his shadow long, her steps uncertain, and when they reached his horse, she looked back once at the crowd that had measured her worth and found it small. The chief looked too, but not at them, at the sky above, blazing and endless, and for the first time that day, the town of Dry Creek felt ashamed of the sun. The coins lay forgotten in the dirt, glinting like the last lies of a world that thought it could own anything. When they reached the far edge of town, the noise of the auction was still echoing like a curse that wouldn't settle, and the girl kept glancing back as if she feared the laughter would follow her. The Lakota chief didn't speak. He walked beside his horse with the slow patience of a man who had carried both life and death too many times to count. The blanket he had given her smelled of smoke and sage, rough but warm, and she held it close, trembling less from cold than from disbelief that kindness could happen in daylight. Behind them, coins still glinted in the dirt like ghosts of what men called value. A dog barked once, sharp and hollow, then nothing but wind. The chief led her toward the river crossing, where cottonwoods bent low with the weight of dust, and only when they reached the water did he stop. He looked at her face, not the bruises or the torn lip, but the eyes, the way they stayed steady even after everything, and he said softly, "You remember your name?" She hesitated, voice raw. "Eliza," he nodded. "Then keep it. No one takes that again." She looked down at the shallow river, the current flashing silver in the light, and whispered, "Why did you stop them?" He crouched, touching the water with his hand. "Because mercy is older than money." She didn't understand, not yet, but the tone made her chest ache. From across the ridge a bell clanged, noon still tolling long after justice had ended, and the chief turned his face toward the sound, eyes narrowing against the sun. "They'll come," he said. "They always do when shame has a badge." Eliza's fingers gripped the blanket tighter. "What will you do?" He tied the horse's reins to a branch and answered without looking at her, "What I must." Then he filled his canteen, checked the sky, and added, "But not before she rests." He wasn't speaking of her anymore. He was speaking of the land itself, the river, the air heavy with guilt. For a long while neither moved. The world seemed caught between breath and prayer, and when the wind shifted, it carried the faint laughter from town, already fading into memory. The chief straightened, shoulders squared against the horizon. "Come," he said, "we'll find shelter before the sun turns cruel." She followed, small steps matching his long ones, and behind them the river kept whispering the same thing over and over, "Not for silver, not for silver." They found the cabin half buried in cottonwood shade, its roof sagging and its chimney crooked, but still breathing faint smoke from some forgotten season. Calder, the Lakota chief, pushed open the warped door with a grunt, the hinges complaining like they hadn't been asked to show mercy in years. Inside, dust hung in the air like thin fog, the kind that remembers old prayers, and Eliza stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter a stranger's silence or stay in the sun that had betrayed her once already. "Go in," he said gently. "Fire remembers what it's for." She stepped across the threshold, blankets still wrapped around her, bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. Calder set his bow against the wall, found a cracked lantern, and lit it with flint, the flame jumping to life as if eager to see kindness again. In the sudden glow, she saw a single bed, a rough table, and a Bible missing its cover. "Whose place is this?" she asked. He smiled, faint and weary. "Once a trapper's. He went north with the winter and didn't come back. The land keeps what it wants." He spread a buffalo hide near the hearth and motioned for her to sit. "Rest now." She hesitated, fingers clutching the blanket like it was proof she still existed. "They'll come," she whispered. "The sheriff, the preacher, all of them." Calder stirred the coals in the hearth until a small flame caught, filling the cabin with warmth and smoke that smelled like cedar and truth. "Then we'll give them something to see," he said, "a man who prays with his hands instead of his tongue." She looked at him then, really looked, the long braid streaked with gray, the scar running across his knuckles. The calm that came not from peace but from surviving too long without it, and something in her steadied. Outside, a crow called once and flew toward the ridge where the town slept guilty. Calder poured her water from his flask and handed her a piece of dried venison from his pouch. "Eat. Tomorrow we ride east to the river fork. I know people there who remember promises." She took the food, chewing slow, her eyes on the flicker of the fire. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. "I know what they did," he replied. "That's enough." The flame snapped, brightening his face, and for a moment she thought she saw sadness there, the kind that carries names he never says aloud. When he spoke again, it was almost to the fire. "They think mercy is weakness. It's not. It's the only thing that ever wins." The night deepened. The river hummed through the trees, and Eliza lay down beside the hearth, still wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. The last thing she heard before sleep was his low voice whispering in Lakota, a prayer older than law, softer than silver. And though she didn't know the words, she understood their weight. Morning came slow, sliding through the cracks in the cabin wall like gold sneaking past shame. Calder was already outside, sharpening a knife on a flat stone while the river hissed softly behind him. Eliza woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, bitter and alive, and for a moment she thought she'd dreamed the auction, the rope, the laughter. Then she saw the chief's coat hanging by the door, its fringe still dusted with the same dirt that had held the coins they'd thrown at her, and the memory came back whole. She rose quietly, folded the blanket, and stepped out into the cool light. Calder looked up, nodded once, then poured her a tin cup. "You'll need strength," he said. "The road don't forgive hunger." She took the cup, hands trembling. "Where are we going?" "To the ridge," he answered. "To a friend who remembers the old ways." Before she could ask more, the sound of hooves came from beyond the trees, slow, deliberate, heavy with authority. Calder's jaw tightened. "Stay inside," he murmured. She froze in the doorway as the sheriff rode up, hat low, badge flashing like a coin in the morning light. His voice carried the kind of tired authority that comes from pretending law is the same thing as justice. "Boone," he called. "You caused a storm yesterday. Folks are talking." Calder didn't move, just wiped the blade clean on his sleeve. "Let 'em talk." The sheriff dismounted, boots sinking into damp earth. "You took what wasn't yours. The preacher says the girl's bound by contract." Calder met his gaze, steady as mountain stone. "Then the preacher's bound by sin." The sheriff sighed, looked toward the cabin. saw Eliza's shadow behind the curtain. "You can't keep her," he said. "The town won't have peace till she's back in their books." Calder stood slowly, taller now, voice like gravel rolled in thunder. "Then the town's peace ain't worth keepin'?" For a moment neither spoke. A jay screamed from the trees, the sound slicing the quiet. Finally the sheriff stepped back, pulling at his reins. "You've got till sundown to ride. After that I can't stop them." "Wasn't expecting you to," Calder said. The sheriff hesitated, then leaned closer. "You're a good man, Boone. Don't let mercy kill you." Calder gave a faint smile. "If it does, it's a better death than most earn." The sheriff turned, mounted, and rode off, leaving a swirl of dust and doubt behind. When he was gone, Eliza stepped out, face pale but eyes clear. "They'll come," she said. Calder sheathed the knife, watching the ridge where the rider vanished. "Then we meet them in daylight," he said. "No shadows left for cowards to hide in." The river kept whispering behind them, the same word over and over like a vow made of water and faith. Mercy, mercy, mercy. By midday, the air shimmered, like heat was ashamed of itself, and the small cabin stood quiet except for the sound of the river rubbing against its banks. Calder sat on the porch steps, carving the edge of a cedar branch, each stroke steady as prayer, while Eliza watched from the doorway, her hair pulled back with a strip of cloth torn from the blanket he'd given her. The world around them felt balanced on a knife, too still, too bright, waiting for something to move. From the ridge came a thin dust cloud, the kind made by men who ride with a purpose they've already justified. Calder saw it first. He set the carving aside, picked up his rifle, and checked the chamber, though his eyes said he hoped not to use it. Eliza's voice shook when she whispered, "Is it them?" He didn't look away from the horizon. "Law don't walk that straight unless it's coming for someone." Within minutes, the shapes took form. 3 riders, the sheriff's star glinting among them. The lead horse snorted, sensing the tension before its rider did. Calder stepped down into the sunlight, his shadow stretching long and calm. The sheriff reined up 10 paces short. "Didn't expect you to make it easy," he said. Calder's tone was mild. "Didn't expect you to make it right." The 2 men stared at each other, time heavy between them. "She's just a girl, Boone," the sheriff said finally. "You can't save everyone." Calder's gaze softened but didn't bend. "Ain't trying to save everyone, just this one. So maybe the next man remembers he can." Behind him, Eliza stepped out, chin lifted, eyes dry. "I'm not going back," she said, voice clear as the river. The younger deputy shifted uneasily, glancing between her and the sheriff. "Orders, sir?" he murmured. The sheriff's shoulders slumped, the sound of weariness louder than his words. "Orders are for men who stop listening to their own souls." He turned his horse slightly, nodding once to Calder. "You didn't hear it from me, but the road east is clear till nightfall." Calder gave a slow nod, no triumph in it, only gratitude that looked too heavy to lift. The sheriff tipped his hat, muttered something about decency costing too much, and rode away. When the dust settled, Calder exhaled, long and low, then looked at Eliza. "You see that line they rode off on?" She nodded. "That's mercy," he said. "A thin one, but it holds." The wind carried his words across the grass, soft as forgiveness, and somewhere downriver the echo came back, like the land itself agreeing. They left before the sun reached its cruelest height, the river behind them whispering a goodbye that sounded too much like warning. Calder rode first, scanning the horizon with the patience of a man who trusted the land more than luck, and Eliza followed on the old roan mare he'd untied from the cabin post, the same horse that had once carried a hunter's burden, but now bore something closer to hope. The trail wound through mesquite and dry sage, the kind of country that remembers every hoofprint, and the wind kept shifting as if to remind them that peace was a borrowed thing. Neither spoke for miles. The silence wasn't empty. It was steady, like 2 prayers learning the same rhythm. When they stopped to rest at a narrow wash, Eliza shaded her eyes against the glare and asked, "Where does this road end?" Calder poured her water from his canteen, the metal warm from the ride. "East," he said, "where people still remember how to welcome strangers." She drank slow, her lips cracked but steady. "And after?" He tied the canteen back to his saddle. "After, the land decides." The answer should have frightened her, but it didn't. The way he said it made her believe that mercy wasn't something you waited for. It was something you carried until someone else needed it. A hawk circled high, the only witness to their journey, its cry sharp against the quiet. Calder's gaze followed it until it vanished into the glare. "That bird don't care who owns the ground," he said softly. "It just keeps to the wind." Eliza smiled faintly. "Then maybe we're both learning from it." They rode again, slower this time, the heat thickening, their shadows stretching long and thin across the valley floor. By late afternoon, the ridge behind them was no more than a memory, and the scent of rain began to creep in from the south, sharp and wild. Calder stopped, turning his horse toward a stand of cottonwoods. "We camp there," he said. "Storm will find us if we don't." The first thunder rolled as they reached the trees, low and distant like an old heart remembering how to beat. Calder built a small fire, careful and patient, while Eliza gathered kindling with quiet purpose. When the rain came, it didn't fall hard. It just washed the dust from the air until the world smelled clean again. Under the shelter of a leaning oak, Calder stared into the flames, his face lit gold in shadow. "You ever wonder why the world keeps breaking the gentle ones first?" he asked. Eliza looked at him through the flicker. "Maybe so the rest can see what kindness costs." He nodded slowly, a man who knew she was right. The rain eased, the fire hissed, and somewhere beyond the trees, the river kept moving east, carrying their silence with it. The storm returned before dawn, harder this time, thunder crawling down the sky like a beast made of memory, and Calder woke to the hiss of rain hitting the fire pit until only smoke remained. Eliza stirred under the wool blanket, her breath shallow, her hair damp against her cheek. He moved quietly, rebuilding the flame with flint and patience, the sparks catching on the edge of a half-dry log until light pushed back against the dark. "We'll ride when it eases," he said, voice low. She nodded, eyes wide, her fear quieter now, less about men, more about the sky. He handed her the last of the bread, and she tore it in half without thinking, giving him the larger piece. He didn't argue, he just took it with a nod that said, respect went both ways. When the rain slowed to a whisper, Calder stood, water dripping from his coat, and looked east through the thinning mist. The world beyond the trees had turned the color of pewter, the road slick and shining like a blade. "They'll follow?" she asked. "Always," he said, mounting his horse, "but they'll tire before the truth does." They rode through the storm's dying breath, hooves splashing through mud, the air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. At a narrow pass where the hills began to close in, they found a toppled cross half buried in the soil, the wood split and scorched by lightning. Calder dismounted, brushing the mud from its face, and read the single carved word, mercy. He stared at it a long time before saying, "Seems the sky remembers what men forget." Eliza climbed down, knelt beside him, and touched the cross with careful fingers. "Is it a grave?" she whispered. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just the earth reminding us to kneel for something besides gold." The rain began again, softer now, like the world exhaling. She closed her eyes, whispering a small prayer, not for safety, but for strength to believe in what she'd already seen, a stranger's kindness worth more than silver. Calder watched her, the scars along his hand shining faintly in the wet light, and for the first time in years he spoke a prayer of his own, half Lakota, half silence. Let what we save outlive what we've lost. When they stood, the clouds were parting, sunlight leaking through like forgiveness, and together they mounted and rode on, leaving behind the cross, the storm, and every coin that ever tried to buy a soul. By afternoon, the sky had cleared into that hard western blue that makes every promise look fragile, and the trail curved through a shallow basin where the wind ran wild between the hills. Calder's horse caught scent first, ears pricked, muscles tense, and he reined in, studying the far ridge. Eliza followed his gaze and saw them. 3 riders, silhouettes against the light, moving in a loose triangle like wolves who'd already chosen their prey. "Townmen," Calder murmured. "Not law, just guilt trying to wear a badge." He led his horse into the shadow of a limestone outcrop, motioning for her to stay low. "They'll follow the track," he said, "but they won't track truth worth a damn." The riders reached the basin floor, voices carrying faint on the wind, angry, unsure, their courage thin in daylight. "They say he stole her," one called. "They say he's hiding the devil's child." The words drifted, ugly and empty. Calder's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the memory of how easily men made stories to hide from mercy. He turned to Eliza. "When they come close, you stay behind the horse. Don't speak till I tell you." She nodded, eyes wide but steady. The first rider spotted the fresh prints near the rock and pointed. "There!" he shouted, spurring forward. Calder stepped out from cover, calm as a stone in deep water. "You looking for me?" he said, voice even. The horses balked, sensing something sacred in the quiet. The lead rider, a storekeeper with more whiskey than courage, raised his pistol. "You took what ain't yours!" Calder's eyes didn't blink. "Then show me who she belongs to." The man hesitated, lowering his aim just an inch, thrown off by the stillness. "She's a sinner," he barked. She's breathing," Calder cut in. "That's enough reason to keep her safe." The words hit harder than threat. The second rider shifted, shame creeping into his face. "We ain't here to kill no one," he muttered. "Then ride home," Calder said. "Tell your sons you saw a man stand where decency fell." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the youngest of them, barely old enough to shave, turned his horse, mumbling, "Ain't worth damning ourselves." One by one they followed, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. Calder watched until they were gone, then exhaled slow, like a man returning from prayer. Eliza stepped out, tears she didn't notice tracing through the dust on her cheeks. "You didn't shoot," she whispered. Calder looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to count as a smile. "Mercy don't need bullets," he said. "It just needs someone to hold still long enough for it to speak." They rode on, the hills closing behind them, the sun sliding west, and for the first time since the auction, Eliza felt the world move without cruelty. The next day broke red and restless, the kind of dawn that feels like a warning more than a gift. They followed the valley down toward the wide river, where willows leaned into the water like old mourners and smoke drifted from something burning far beyond the bend. Calder dismounted first, crouching low, fingers pressing into the ash scattered across the stones. "Campfire," he said. "Too big for one traveler." Eliza scanned the horizon, pulse quickening. "The riders?" He shook his head. "No, army." He pointed to a half-charred sign half buried in mud. Agency post, burned out. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of scorched corn and wet wood, and in it she thought she could hear the faint echo of weeping, or maybe the river's own grief. Calder walked ahead, boots sinking into soft ground, eyes dark with the knowledge of old violence. The post had been small, 2 shacks, a flagpole, a corral, but now it was nothing but ruin. "Why would they burn it?" Eliza whispered. He brushed soot from a fallen beam. "Because paper needed fire to feel like power." He straightened, the sunlight catching the thin scar along his jaw. "They say mercy weakens a nation. I say cruelty already has." She watched him kneel beside a half-buried tin star, the kind soldiers used to wear when they forgot they were men before they were orders. "Will they come back?" she asked. "No," he said. "Men who do this don't come back, they just spread." He turned, gaze softening. "But we still ride east. The river's long enough to wash memory clean." Eliza looked at the water, its surface thick and shining like a mirror that refused to lie. "Do you ever think you're fighting a battle already lost?" she asked quietly. Calder's hand closed around a handful of ashes, letting them fall slow through the sunlight. All battles are lost till someone decides mercy's worth another round. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke away, and for the first time the air smelled almost clean. He found a feather caught in a burned post, half black, half white, and held it out to her. "Keep it," he said. "Not as a promise, just a reminder that the world still splits between what we do and what we forgive." She tucked it into the braid of her hair, eyes glinting like wet flint. "Then we ride for the forgiving part." Calder smiled faintly, mounting again. "That's the only part left worth reaching." As they rode along the riverbank, the water gleamed brighter with every mile, and somewhere in its current, the ashes began to vanish, one grain of guilt at a time. By the time they reached the eastern ridge, the world had turned soft again, the grass bending in a wind that smelled of rain and distant wheat. The road behind them had narrowed to a single trail barely visible among the sage, as if the earth itself wanted to forget how cruel men could be. Calder stopped his horse at the crest, looking out over the valley below where a small settlement shimmered in the afternoon light, smoke curling from chimneys, children running between cabins, a bell tower leaning like an old friend. "That's the place," he said quietly. "They remember prayers there." Eliza sat beside him, her hands folded around the feather in her braid, the one he'd pulled from the ashes. "And after we reach it?" she asked. "After," he said, "you decide if the world still feels worth staying in." She didn't answer right away. The sky stretched wide and forgiving above them, and she thought of the auction, of laughter that had broken like glass, of hands that had lifted her without claiming. "You never asked for anything," she said finally. Calder's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Didn't need to. Mercy pays its own debt." They rode down slow, hooves crunching through dry grass, the valley light turning gold. When they reached the edge of the town, a woman came from one of the cabins, gray-haired, strong, her eyes lined by kindness. "Boone," she called, smiling, "you still bring strays." Calder dismounted, helping Eliza down. "She's no stray," he said. "She's the reason a man remembers he's still human." The woman looked at Eliza with gentle curiosity. "You'll have a home here, child, if you want it." Eliza met Calder's eyes, searching for something unspoken. "You'll stay?" she asked. He shook his head. "The land keeps me moving, always has." She stepped closer, fingers brushing the edge of his coat. "Then take this." She unpinned the feather from her hair and pressed it into his hand. "For when mercy feels far." He closed his fingers around it like it was made of breath. "It never is," he said. The bell rang from the small church, a clean, honest sound that rolled across the fields, and he turned his horse toward the trail. As he rode out, the wind shifted west, carrying the smell of hearth smoke and bread, and behind him, Eliza's voice rose faint and steady. "Not for silver." He didn't look back. The road curved into the setting sun, light pouring over him like water made of forgiveness. He rode until the town was a whisper and the world was quiet again. Then stopped by a ridge where the horizon caught fire in gold. He raised the feather to the sky, eyes closed, and whispered, "You're safe." The wind answered, soft and certain, wrapping him in the same warmth he'd once given away. And somewhere beyond the light, the world finally remembered what mercy looked like. If this story reminded you that redemption doesn't come easy, but it always comes for those who choose mercy, then share it so others remember too. Subscribe to Redemption West, where every wound learns to heal, every silence learns to speak, and every story proves that love still builds.